We have today with us Shannon Pratt. Shannon is our go-to person when it comes to anything about the environment and sustainability and flying. Shannon has been with us. I'll allow Shannon to speak about his background, but Shannon has been with us as part of the Aviation X Lab from the very start in terms of understanding what are key priorities, what are the key technologies we want to focus on, and making sure that we're not duplicating any efforts, looking at what other companies are working on, and of course what Emirates is focusing on as well. So with that, Shannon, I will hand it over to you. And if
Thanks
you
very much, Amna.
About your experience and what you do in Emirates.
Sure, thanks very much, Amna. It's a pleasure to be here. So I look after environment affairs at Emirates. I'm part of the international affairs team in the company, and in our environmental affairs department, we pretty much look after everything and anything to do with environment. So that ranges from the international compliance and reporting obligations, such as working with the EU emissions trading system, running a compliance program for that every year. Now we also have a CORSIA compliance program. We've submitted our first annual report for that. And on top of the compliance program, we also deal with the annual reporting. So corporate reporting on environmental data. This year, for the first time, we published our environmental data in the Emirates Group annual report. So we used to publish environmental reports standalone, and now we're bringing that data into the annual report as a reflection of kind of the importance that many stakeholders are placing on seeing what companies are doing. And as well as these areas, we also work internally in assisting other parts of the business in operating in more environmentally effective ways, finding efficiencies, and sharing best practice across the organization. So those are probably the three broad areas. And within those, of course, there's many and multiple different topics that we get involved in. Everything from the emissions, the carbon side, through to dealing with noising with electric vehicles, through to waste management and recycling.
Thank you, Shannon. I think that's very interesting because when we think about an airline and environmental affairs, you wouldn't usually connect all these different aspects that you just discussed. But it's interesting to hear that no, in fact, the airline does kind of oversee a lot of different angles when it comes to the environment. So thank you for shedding some light on that. So Shannon, we received some questions from the applicants, and I'm just going to run you through some of the questions that we had received that I thought could be interesting for yourself as the Carbon Negative Aviation Industry Council member. So the first question is, and it's quite interesting, and I think we get this quite a lot, right? Our moonshot, and is the carbon negative aviation industry a realistic goal? And of course it's not. It's a moonshot, and it's supposed to sound as impossible as it is. But I think I'd like to also get your input in terms of, do you think a carbon negative aviation industry could be implemented at some point in the future?
So carbon negative is a great topic, and it really is a moonshot. And to me, what carbon negative means is that you are, well, as an organization or an industry, you are storing or sequestering more carbon than you emit into the atmosphere. So obviously, we've got a big challenge with that in aviation because we rely almost entirely on fossil fuels. And why do we rely on fossil fuels? Kerosene, liquid kerosene, basically. It's because it's actually the most efficient and most energy dense fuel that there is. It's actually really good fuel for moving aircraft around the world, particularly looking at the kind of long haul flights with body aircraft that we do. So the challenge is, how do you find alternatives to that? Now, of course, there are different ways to deal with this problem, and I'll refer to the IATA, the International Air Transport Association's 4-pillar strategy here, because that kind of covers the 4 big brush areas that we can follow. The first of these is the technology. So I would say technology, primarily it's the aircraft and the engines. So can you make the aircraft and the engines more efficient and burn less fuel per passenger kilometer or ton kilometer? Can you change the fuel type? Using biofuels or other types of alternative fuels, power fuels. Can you even move towards electric aircraft? And there's interesting research and development underway on that as well. So that's the first area, the technology. Second area is the operations, and traditionally we put a lot of emphasis on that as well. So that's how do you fly, how do you operate your aircraft the most efficient way possible. The third area is the infrastructure. So infrastructure can include your airport infrastructure. So building your runways and taxiways in a different design can improve the throughput and can greatly improve the efficiency of the operation. Likewise, the air traffic management infrastructure. There's still many unrealized opportunities around the world in providing a more efficient ATM infrastructure. So yeah, those are probably the three core kind of aeronautical areas. Then the fourth area is the economic measures. And these are the market-based measures such as CORSIA, which maybe many of you have heard about in recent times because it's been in the news in the last week, how ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, now is changing the baseline for the CORSIA scheme to only take into account 2019 emissions, at least for the pilot phase, because of the impact of COVID-19 and what that was going to do to future carbon offsetting requirements and the impacts that would have on the industry. So yeah, those are the four big pillars that we've got to focus on, and all of those play a role. Some of them have bigger opportunities than others, but every bit counts.
Shannon, I think you make some great points, and just linking to some of the points you made, it actually ties quite well with the second question, which discusses any when it comes to capturing carbon, right? Would that be a priority as well when it comes to looking at solutions?
So carbon capture technology is really interesting, and that is part of a suite of the technologies that are being developed to develop what are being called power fuels or power to liquid fuels. So broadly, what that involves is you need two things. One is a source of carbon dioxide or other carbon-based gases, very lightweight gases. Carbon dioxide works perfectly. And the other thing you need is a source of hydrogen. You need to get the hydrogen from preferably renewable generated electricity, electrolyzing, splitting water. And then the carbon dioxide you can get from two potential sources. One is from industrial off gases, but obviously you've still got to have the industry there producing the carbon dioxide in the first place. Or the other option is direct air capture, which is taking dioxide directly from the air. And then you react the carbon dioxide with the hydrogen through a reaction process, and ultimately you can produce liquid hydrocarbons, including jet fuel, at the end of that process. There's a lot of work going into that, particularly in Europe at the moment. The direct air capture part of this, it's obviously got the greatest long-term potential for delivering really meaningful carbon reductions in the full life cycle of the liquid fuels. The challenge it has at the moment is that it's still very expensive. So the effort at the moment in the R&D is to see how can you improve the efficiency of that process and make it more reliable and take less resource effectively to produce that carbon dioxide from the air.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I would have never thought so much goes into it, but it's quite a complex procedure. Shannon, I think the next question would be quite interesting for everyone on the call, and that's discussing, how the current pandemic impacted travel sustainability, if it has at all.
Yes, that's a multifaceted question, really. So, I mean, if you look at sustainability in its broader sense, then absolutely it has, because It's affected the prospects for so many places, the impacts on tourism, impacts on people's jobs and livelihoods. There's probably very few industries, very few people that have been untouched by this in terms of the personal and the economic impacts. So certainly, absolutely the social side, the economic side. On the environmental side of sustainability, well, you could say, yeah, there's a lot fewer emissions now. But obviously that's a result of flying less. So, and that's the trade-off of the loss of the benefits and the amenity that international air transport provides. There's probably also some impact in terms of the focus now in so many industries is on survival, like getting through this crisis. So there's maybe a little less focus on some of the projects that industries had hoped to get up and running in the shorter term. Doesn't mean those projects have gone away. It's just that the short-term focus for resourcing and everything else is to basically keep the industry moving. And then another area which I think is having some impact is around the single-use plastics and similar areas. And we'd put so much effort, including in Emirates, into reducing the amount of single-use plastic on board. And unfortunately now, the emphasis has to be on safety and has to be on hygiene. And that means we're all wearing masks to work, and when we go to the shop, we're all, we wear gloves sometimes when we have to, and on board, that there's things have to be wrapped in plastic. So there's going to be an ongoing challenge.
Yes, exactly, and I think that was exactly what I also wanted to mention, that there's a lot that has been introduced because of the pandemic, even when it's things like wearing your mask and changing that at least a couple of times during the flight, and everyone getting disposable cutlery and whatnot and all these different things. So, even though you might fly less and you kind of like create the negative carbon from that side, but then you also balance it out from the other perspective.
That's right. So it really is a whole set of new challenges as it is for everyone, but that's not to say that we're taking the eye off the ball there. So the team, for example, looking after the in-flight product, within the realms of what can be done, then they're still looking at what's a more effective solution. So you've got to solve now the concerns, but what's the most important environmentally.
That's absolutely true. It's interesting to hear. Shannon, another interesting point that has been made, and I think we all kind of think about this quite often, and a lot of the different solutions always look at offsetting, right? But do you think that plants and trees have a big role to play when it comes to carbon emissions, at least for the airline industry itself?
Obviously, plants and trees are essential to life on Earth, so I think we should all embrace them. We don't necessarily need to hug them, but we need to embrace them. But from the point of view of the more focused part of mitigating our carbon emissions, not so straightforward as just planting a lot of trees to offset our emissions, because you've got to consider the lifetime uptake of the carbon dioxide of the trees. What happens at the end of the tree's life is that plantation protected. Different types of trees, different types of plantations have different uptake of carbon dioxide, and so on. The best way to set up carbon offsetting programs that involve forests and reforestation and so on. And some very interesting work has come out in the last couple of years around the program. Sorry, I can't even remember the acronym now, but essentially. And the point of this is developing a program in the best way possible to make sure that A, you keep that forest in place, B, you also put in place buffers to deal with any kind of potential loss due to fires, or that sort of thing, and C, that you also deal with the social aspects of managing a forest, because some carbon offsetting programs involving forests in the past came into a lot of criticism because they didn't take into account the the needs of the communities around those forests. So these new sets of programs, the good ones, really take into account the whole spectrum, not just the carbon offsetting part of it, but the whole ecosystem and the social system that are embedded around that forest. So yes, they do play a role, but it's not straightforward.
Yeah, no, not at all, exactly. But no, you're absolutely right. They are quite essential, and it is the root of all things at the end. Shannon, the next question is slightly, I don't want to say political, but it's got to do with, what are your views when it comes to the EU imposing emissions on incoming flights from outside of the EU? And I think it'll be interesting to kind of understand, do you think that, such restrictions would contribute in a positive manner towards the aviation industry? Is it only going to result in people just flying less? Because you see a lot of different regulations from different countries coming through, and obviously not all of them are standard, and it all depends on where that airplane is flying in from as well.
Yeah, so I think this question possibly comes back to the program called the EU Emissions Trading System. And when this was first developed, it did in fact, the intention of the scheme was in fact to include all flights flying other countries into the EU and out of the EU, and require those aircraft operators to buy EU emissions allowances to cover all of their emissions on those flights. Because that resulted in massive international debate, dealing with all sorts of aspects, from extraterritoriality to the impact on the airlines and so on. As a result of that, in around 2013-14, it was, EU decided no, they would only apply the ETS to flights within the European Economic Area, and that's where it stands at the moment as well. Now, the flip side of that was that the industry advocated very strongly for it, was to set up a global scheme to deal with the international emissions. And that's the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation under CORSIA, which is implemented by ICAO. And every ICAO member state around the world is implementing it, including the UAE. So the purpose behind this is that after 2020, we would have to buy carbon offsets for our growth in international emissions over and above the baseline. The baseline now is the emissions of 2019, thanks to the COVID crisis.
Yeah.
So that's where the EU still sits as well. The EU has supported CORSIA, and they are also maintaining the EU ETS for intra-European. There is a bit of that we can put that debate just to the side for now. From the point of view of, say, a long-haul flight from UAE to Paris, that's out of scope now for the EU ETS, as long as they maintain the legislation as it is.
Okay, that makes sense. There's too many, quite a lot of regulations I can see in this world. Shannon, we have one question actually in the chat room from a potential applicant. And their question is, what about aircraft redesign concepts for a carbon negative industry? Just to clarify, designs or ideas that focus on aircraft movement at airports in a more environmentally friendly and fuel efficient manner.
Okay, so we're talking about, I haven't seen the chat, so let me just pop that up.
So I think it's, okay, when it comes to like...
So I'm just rereading it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so aircraft movement. I think at the moment, because the bulk of an aircraft emissions is actually in the air. It's predominantly focused on how do you make the aircraft itself as efficient as possible for its flight phase. Now, on the ground at the airport, that leads to other problems. And actually, interestingly, the Boeing 777X is dealing with that because you need a longer, a longer wing actually makes a more efficient aircraft. But the 777X's wing's too long to fit into a normal airport parking area. So Boeing solved that problem by putting folding wingtips on the 777X, which is a first for an airliner. Aircraft carrier, military aircraft have had that for many decades, but never on an airliner. So it's quite an exciting concept. The other opportunity around there is reducing the amount of time you spend taxiing or basically on the taxiways with your engines running or your engines on idle. And one of the ways to do that is operationally, we do that now, is to switch one engine off when you can, when you're taxiing in. But another option, and there's quite a lot of work going into this as well, is where you can actually tow an aircraft out using an electric tractor until it's ready to be switched on. Now you can't just tow it to the end of the runway because the engines also have to have time to warm up before you take off. So there's a lot of sort of flight operations requirements to put into play before you implement one of these schemes, but they are certainly being looked at. Okay,
that's interesting. I didn't know that a lot of it, when it comes to the airplane design, can actually have quite a magnificent impact to a certain extent on the environment as well. So that's quite interesting going forward.
Quite a lot.
Shannon, so I think I have one last question, and this is a beautiful closing, I want to say. And that is, why is sustainability important to the airline? And I think this is interesting because when you look at the contribution of airlines to the overall carbon emissions, and I think I learned this fact from you, if the numbers are still valid, it's just over 2% of the overall emissions, right? But as you can see, and even from Emirates' perspective, there's quite a lot of effort and engagement being done to ensure that airlines are sustainable. Do you want to shed some light as to why that is very important for airlines?
I think as airlines, of course, all of us want to see a more sustainable world. So that we start from that point. And airlines, we're in the business of sharing the world with everybody. So I think we play such an important role. And then if we want people to be able to enjoy this wonderful world around it, then we've got to be looking after it ourselves. But from a more narrow perspective, from the airline itself, first of all, operating more sustainably actually does reduce costs. So you think about the fuel burn. Fuel is our number one operating cost. If we can reduce fuel consumption, then that reduces our overall cost base as well. Secondly, it's more and more important to our customers as well. Particularly, we see corporate customers who are also being asked by their customers and their stakeholders about what they're doing throughout their value chain. And that then flows through to us. So making sure that we are meeting the needs of our customers as well. So I think there's a whole range of reasons, but those would be two of the big ones for us.
No, I think that makes quite a lot of sense, and you're absolutely right, especially when you think about airlines attempting to be sustainable. The cost part is quite magnificent, and I don't think we really realize that. And we just assume that it's not, it doesn't really impact. But when it comes to fuel and a lot of these different aspects, then it does pay off long term to be sustainable, definitely.
There's one other thing I wanted to add too, is that why is aviation getting so much attention in this area? And again, it comes back to my point in that first year, is that we're so reliant on liquid fossil fuels at the moment as our main energy source. And while other industries have had opportunities to decarbonize, as aviation has continued to be successful and has continued to grow, we are struggling a bit in that area because the continue to grow. So that's why the focus has come onto aviation to see, okay, what are we doing to reduce our emissions when the trajectory for future growth, more people want to fly, more people want to travel the world, but that means more growth. How then do we reduce emissions to deal with that growth?
That makes quite a lot of sense. It's interesting when it comes to sustainability and the aviation and airline world, because you're absolutely right. Airlines do get quite a lot of attention as opposed to other industries, but I never thought of it from that perspective. That's very interesting. Thank you, Shannon. Shannon, these were all the questions that we had received. Do you want to share a few final words to our potential applicants 3 days to the deadline?
Yeah, there's just one thing is that I think one of the key points in aviation is that aviation is really highly standardized. So whatever solution you come up with or that you propose, making it scalable is really important. So the more scalable it is, the more you can roll it out across the business and potentially the industry as well, then the more likely it's going to have uptake.
Okay, that's great advice. Thank you so much, Shannon.